The ink on her marriage certificate was barely dry when the gavel fell. Silas didn't just lose their ranch in a poker game. He bet her, sold like cattle to the cruelest man in Wyoming, until a dust-covered stranger threw a bag of gold on the table and claimed her. The history books of Laramie, Wyoming, will tell you about the harsh blizzard of 1882, but they conveniently leave out the sins that took place at the Copper Queen Saloon on a sweltering Tuesday in August. They don't write about how a man could legally sign away a human life if the paperwork was dressed up right. Abigail Prescott stood in the center of the sawdust-covered floor, her calico dress stiff with alkali dust, her wrists gripped so tightly by her husband, Silas, that her fingers were going numb. The saloon was thick with the suffocating stench of cheap rye whiskey, stale tobacco, and unwashed men. But the most putrid thing in the room was the desperation radiating from the man she had sworn to love and honor just 6 months prior. Silas was a man hollowed out by his vices. His eyes were bloodshot, darting wildly around the room, while a nervous sweat plastered his thin, unkempt hair to his forehead. Across the felt-lined poker table sat Jeremiah Dalton. Dalton wasn't just a cattle baron, he was a plague. He owned the local bank, the sheriff's office, and the gambling debts of half the territory. He was a mountain of a man with a ruined left eye, milk-white and dead, and a smile that resembled a gash across his weathered face. $3,000, Silas. Dalton's voice was like grinding stones. He leaned back in his chair, lazily thumbing a gold pocket watch. That was the line of credit extended to you. You lost the herd. You lost the deed to the acreage on the Powder River. You have nothing left but the clothes on your back. I can get it, Jeremiah. Just give me a month. 1 month on the rail line. I don't deal in time, Silas. I deal in collateral. Dalton's good eyes slid slowly from the trembling husband to the pale, terrified wife. A sickening grin spread across his face. Though, I suppose you ain't entirely without assets. Abigail's heart dropped into her stomach. Silas, no, she whispered, her voice trembling. Let's just leave. We can walk away. We can start over. But Silas wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. Instead, he stared at the piece of parchment Dalton's lawyer, a weasel of a man named Finch, slid across the table. It wasn't a bill of sale. Slavery was outlawed, after all. It was a contract of indentured servitude and debt transfer. By signing it, Silas was agreeing to legally bind his wife to Dalton's estate for a term of 20 years to work off the debt. In the lawless expanse of the Wyoming Territory, it was as good as a slave collar. Sign it, Dalton purred, or my men drag you out to the alley, put a bullet in your kneecaps, and I take her anyway to cover the inconvenience. The silence in the Copper Queen was deafening. 30 men sat at the bar, nursing their drinks, looking away. Not a single soul stepped forward. The code of the West dictated you didn't meddle in another man's debts. Silas reached for the pen. "Silas, please," Abigail shrieked, struggling against his grip. "I am your wife. You swore before God." "I'm sorry, Abby. I ain't got a choice," Silas muttered, his voice cracking with a pathetic, cowardly whine. He scratched his name across the bottom of the ledger. Dalton chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. He stood up, towering over them, and reached out to take Abigail's chin in his massive, calloused hand. "Well now, little bird, you belong to the Dalton Ranch. You'll find I'm a demanding employer. Take your hand off my property, Dalton." The voice didn't shout, but it cut through the murmurs of the saloon like a Winchester bullet. Every head turned toward the swinging doors. He stood in the threshold, silhouetted by the harsh afternoon sun. He wore a dust-caked Stetson pulled low, a canvas duster that had seen miles of hard trail, and a low-slung Colt .45 tied down to his thigh. When he stepped into the light, Abigail saw a face carved from granite, a strong jaw shadowed by dark stubble, and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of fear. It was Wyatt Callahan. Even in 1882, the name Callahan commanded a heavy silence in the territory. He wasn't an outlaw, but he wasn't a lawman either. He was a tracker, a horse breeder, and a man who had famously survived a 3-day shootout with the O'Driscoll rustlers down in Texas. Dalton's smile vanished. "This ain't your business, Callahan. The debt is settled. The girl is mine." Wyatt walked slowly to the table, the silver spurs on his boots chiming a death knell with every step. He didn't look at Silas. He didn't look at Abigail. He locked eyes with Dalton. "Silas Prescott owes you $3,000, Wyatt said, his voice a low rumble. He reached inside his heavy duster and tossed a heavy, worn leather saddlebag onto the poker table. It hit the wood with a heavy, metallic thud that made Silas jump. "There's 4,000 in minted gold eagles in there. The debt is paid. The contract is mine." Dalton's good eye narrowed. He didn't want the gold. He wanted the power. He wanted the cruelty of owning a proper lady. "I ain't selling, Callahan. The ink is dry." Wyatt's hand hovered an inch above the walnut grip of his Colt. The tension in the room snapped tight as piano wire. "I wasn't making an offer, Jeremiah. I'm paying a man's debt. Under territorial law, the primary creditor can be bought out. Now, take the gold, or I'll take it back and pay you in lead. Your choice." Dalton looked at the gold, then at the lethal stillness of Wyatt's right hand. Dalton was cruel, but he wasn't suicidal. He sneered, motioning for his lawyer to take the bag. "You're a fool, Callahan, buying a used-up gambler's baggage." Wyatt didn't flinch. He picked up the indentured contract, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his vest pocket. Then, for the first time, he turned his piercing blue eyes to Abigail. She braced herself, waiting for the leering look of a new master. But there was no lust in his eyes, no cruelty, only a hardened resolve. "Come on," Wyatt said quietly. "We're leaving." Abigail looked at Silas, who was staring at the floor, shivering like a whipped dog. With a ragged breath, she turned her back on her husband forever and followed the stranger out into the blinding Wyoming sun. They rode in silence for hours, leaving the soot and sin of Laramie miles behind them. Wyatt had purchased a gentle roan mare for Abigail from the livery before they left town, paying for it with the same casual indifference he had used to buy her life. The Wyoming landscape opened up before them, a vast ocean of sagebrush and gold-tipped prairie grass rolling toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Bighorn Mountains. Under different circumstances, Abigail might have found it beautiful. Today, it just felt like a massive, empty prison. She rode a few paces behind Wyatt, her mind spinning with a terrifying reality. She had been traded from a weak man to a monster and then bought by a ghost. She knew of men like Wyatt Callahan. They lived by violence. They didn't part with $4,000 in gold out of Christian charity. He was going to expect a return on his investment. She steeled herself for what was to come, her jaw clamped shut to keep her teeth from chattering despite the lingering heat of the day. As dusk painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange, Wyatt finally signaled to halt near a narrow, babbling creek surrounded by a thick grove of cottonwood trees. He dismounted with fluid grace, unsaddling his massive black gelding before moving to help her. Abigail flinched as his large, calloused hands reached up to grip her waist, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He set her on the ground and immediately stepped back, giving her space. "There's fresh water in the creek," Wyatt said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "I'll get a fire going." Abigail stood stiffly by the water's edge, watching him work. He was efficient, stripping branches and arranging stones. Within minutes, a small, warm fire was crackling, pushing back the encroaching chill of the high plains night. He tossed her a tin cup of coffee and a plate of hardtack and beans. She held the warm tin cup in her trembling hands. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you buy me?" Wyatt sat across the fire, leaning his forearms on his knees, staring into the flames. He reached into his vest, retrieved the folded contract Silas had signed, and held it out. "I didn't buy you to keep you, Mrs. Prescott," Wyatt said softly. He tossed the parchment into the fire. Abigail gasped, surging forward as the dry paper caught instantly, curling and blackening into ash within seconds. The only legal document binding her to servitude was gone. "You're free," Wyatt stated, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Abigail fell back onto the dirt, the breath leaving her lungs in a ragged sob. She pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the rush of relief, confusion, and lingering terror. "But the gold, $4,000, you just burned it." "Money is just metal," Wyatt replied, his face an unreadable mask. "But we have a problem. The law in this territory is a funny thing. I burned that paper, which means Dalton has no claim on you. But in the eyes of the law, you're still legally bound to Silas Prescott." Abigail's blood ran cold. "Silas won't want me back. He sold me." "He sold you because he was scared of Dalton," Wyatt corrected. "But Silas is a prideful, weak man. Once he realizes the contract is ashes and Dalton doesn't have you, he'll claim you were stolen. He can go to the federal marshals. They'll hunt you down, and they'll force you back to him. A woman alone in this territory has no legal standing, Abigail. You are property until you are widowed or legally claimed." The cruel reality of 1882 settled heavily over her. Freedom was an illusion. "Then, what do I do?" she whispered, looking at the hardened cowboy across the fire. "I have no family, no money, nowhere to run." Wyatt poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of orange sparks into the dark sky. "I have a ranch up in the Bighorns, 2,000 acres. It's isolated, fortified, and safe. You can come with me." "As what? Your maid? Your—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "As my wife," Wyatt said plainly. Abigail blinked, stunned. "Your wife?" "A marriage of convenience," Wyatt explained, his gaze steady and respectful. "If you bear my name, Abigail Callahan, Silas can't touch you. Territorial law dictates that if a husband abandons his wife or trades her for debt, a new marriage can be legitimized by a circuit judge to prevent the woman from becoming a ward of the state. I know a judge in Sheridan who owes me his life. He'll sign the papers, no questions asked. Silas loses all legal claim to you." "And what do you get out of this?" Abigail asked, her eyes narrowing with sudden suspicion. "Men don't throw away fortunes and offer their names for nothing." A dark shadow passed over Wyatt's features. The stoic, calm demeanor cracked for just a fraction of a second, revealing a deep, simmering fury beneath. "Silas didn't just lose his money at the poker tables," Wyatt said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. 3 years ago, in Abilene, My younger brother Thomas was falsely accused of stealing a payroll shipment. He was 19. The man who testified against him, the man who lied to the lynch mob to cover his own theft, was Silas Prescott. Abigail felt the air leave her lungs. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Silas, her weak, pathetic husband, had blood on his hands. They hanged my brother before I could get to town. Wyatt continued, his jaw tightening. I've been hunting Silas for 3 years. I tracked him to Laramie. I walked into that saloon to put a bullet in his head. Then why didn't you? Abigail breathed. Wyatt finally looked her directly in the eyes. Because taking his life would be too quick. He valued his reputation, his ranch, and you, as a possession to be traded. When I saw what he was doing to you, I realized dying was too good for him. I wanted him to live with the humiliation of knowing I took the one thing he used to save his own skin. Wyatt paused, his expression softening just a fraction. And because no woman deserves to be thrown to the wolves to pay for a coward's sins. Abigail stared at the ashes of the contract in the fire pit. She was caught in a deadly web of revenge, pride, and frontier justice. Wyatt Callahan hadn't just saved her. He had used her as a weapon against her husband. Yet, looking at the man across the fire, who had given her food, space, and a choice, she realized she felt safer with this dangerous stranger than she ever had with Silas. We ride for Sheridan at first light, Wyatt said, standing up to check the horses. If you want to go your own way, I'll give you a horse and $50. But Silas and Dalton will likely be looking for us by tomorrow noon. A bruised ego is a dangerous thing. Abigail looked out into the absolute darkness of the plains. She thought of Silas's betrayal, of Dalton's leering smile, and of the legal chains that bound women like cattle. Then she looked at Wyatt's broad back as he brushed down his horse in the moonlight. Callahan, she said softly. Wyatt paused, turning his head. I prefer Abigail Callahan, she said, lifting her chin with a newfound defiance. It sounds like a woman who doesn't run. A ghost of a smile touched Wyatt's lips. Get some sleep, Mrs. Callahan. Tomorrow we ride into the storm. The ride to Sheridan was a grueling 3-day push through the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness. The jagged teeth of the Bighorn Mountains loomed larger with every mile, a majestic but isolating barrier between Abigail and the life she once knew. Wyatt pushed the horses hard, knowing that Jeremiah Dalton's pride was a venomous thing. A man like Dalton didn't let a public humiliation in his own town go unanswered. When they finally reached Sheridan, it was a booming frontier town choked with dust and prospectors. Wyatt didn't stop at the saloons or the general store. He rode straight to the modest clapboard house of Judge Horace Blackwood. Horace was a pragmatic man with a walrus mustache and a debt of honor to the Callahan family that predated Abigail's birth. The ceremony took place in his dim parlor, smelling of pipe tobacco and old leather. There were no flowers, no white lace, and no romantic vows. Just the scratch of a fountain pen on the heavy parchment. By the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, Judge Blackwood rumbled, stamping the document with a heavy seal, I declare this union legal and binding. Any previous claims to the bride are hereby nullified under the Abandonment Act of 1878. You are now man and wife. Abigail stared at the name she had just written. Abigail Rose Callahan. It felt heavy. It was a shield forged from ink, protecting her from the monstrous men of Laramie. She glanced at Wyatt. He was handing the judge a silver dollar, his face impassive. He hadn't smiled once, yet he had just tethered his entire life to a stranger to spite a murderer and save a victim. They left Sheridan within the hour, climbing higher into the mountains until the air grew thin and bitingly cold. By nightfall, they reached the Callahan Ranch. Abigail had expected a rough-hewn bachelor's shack, but what she saw took her breath away. Nestled in a valley surrounded by towering lodgepole pines and a roaring river was a sprawling, fortified homestead. The main cabin was built of thick, weathered logs, flanked by a massive barn and sturdy corrals holding some of the finest quarter horses she had ever seen. It wasn't just a home, it was a fortress built by a man who expected the world to come knocking with a gun in its hand. For the first few weeks, their marriage was a silent, choreographed dance of survival. Wyatt was a ghost in his own home. He spent his days breaking horses and mending fences, returning only at dusk. He gave Abigail the master bedroom, choosing to sleep on a cot by the heavy stone fireplace in the main room. He demanded nothing of her, but Abigail refused to be a burden. The frontier had a way of burning away the soft edges of a person. She learned to chop firewood, to bake sourdough in a Dutch oven over open coals, and to mend Wyatt's heavy canvas work shirts. One evening, as a fierce autumn storm battered the cabin, Wyatt sat by the fire cleaning his Winchester rifle. Abigail watched the steady, meticulous movements of his hands. "You don't talk much about your brother, Thomas," Abigail said softly, pausing her stitching. Wyatt's hands stilled. He didn't look up, but the tension in his shoulders tightened. Not much to say. He was a good kid, trusted the wrong people. Silas saw an easy scapegoat to cover his own embezzling from the rail company. "I never knew," Abigail whispered, shame coloring her cheeks. "I thought Silas was just a fool who liked cards too much. If I had known he was a murderer—" "You wouldn't have been able to change it," Wyatt said, finally looking at her. The coldness in his blue eyes had thawed slightly over the weeks, replaced by a quiet respect. "Silas's sins are his own, Abigail, not yours." He stood up, walking over to the heavy oak table, and placed a smaller, pearl-handled Colt revolver in front of her. "Dalton won't let this go," Wyatt said grimly, "and Silas is cowardly enough to lead him right to our front door. You need to know how to protect yourself." Over the next month, the Bighorn Mountains echoed with the crack of gunfire. Wyatt was a strict teacher, showing her how to load, aim, and fire without flinching. In those hours spent shoulder to shoulder, the icy distance between them began to melt. Abigail found herself watching the way the wind caught Wyatt's dark hair and the way his jaw softened when he calmed a spooked foal. Wyatt, in turn, found his gaze lingering on the fierce determination in Abigail's eyes and the calluses forming on her once soft hands. She was no longer the terrified woman in the Copper Queen saloon. She was becoming a woman of the West. But a storm was brewing in the lowlands. Down in Laramie, Jeremiah Dalton had hired a ruthless tracker named Josiah Cleary to follow the trail of silver spurs and shod hooves. And, trailing right behind them, desperate to reclaim his property and his pride, was Silas Prescott. The first snow of November had just dusted the valley floor when the dogs started barking. Wyatt was in the barn, pitching hay, while Abigail was on the porch, shaking out a rug. The moment she heard the frantic, vicious snarling of the hounds, the blood drained from her face. She looked down the valley pass. 5 riders were cutting through the pines, their dust muted by the snow. At the head of the pack was the mountainous silhouette of Jeremiah Dalton. Beside him rode Josiah Cleary, clutching a shotgun, and trailing behind, looking pale and terrified, was Silas. "Wyatt!" Abigail screamed, dropping the rug and sprinting for the cabin. Wyatt was already out of the barn, his Winchester in his hands. He didn't run. He walked with a terrifying, deliberate calm toward the porch. "Get inside, Abigail. Bar the door. Take the Colt. I am not leaving you out here alone," she fired back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Do as I say," he barked, his eyes locked on the approaching riders. But she didn't go inside. She stood on the porch, her hand gripping the cold iron of the pearl-handled revolver hidden in the folds of her skirt. The riders pulled up 30 yards from the cabin. The silence of the mountain was absolute, save for the snorting of the horses. "Well now, Callahan," Dalton boomed, his dead eye fixed on Wyatt. "You built yourself a nice little hide hole up here. I told you I wasn't selling." "She isn't yours to claim, Dalton," Wyatt said, his voice carrying over the wind. "She is Abigail Callahan, my legal wife. You step 1 foot on my property, and I'll bury you under it." Silas nudged his horse forward, his hands shaking. Abby, listen to me. I made a mistake. Dalton says if I bring you back, he'll forgive the debt. We can go to California. Please, Abby." Abigail looked at the man she had once vowed to love. He looked pathetic, small, and utterly devoid of honor. "You sold me, Silas," she said, her voice ringing clear and steady. "You sold me to save your own miserable life. And before that, you murdered an innocent boy in Abilene. I would rather die on this mountain than spend another minute as your wife." Silas flinched as if struck. Dalton just laughed, a cruel, grating sound. "Spirited," Dalton sneered. "I like that. Cleary, kill Callahan. Leave the woman for me." The world exploded into chaos. Josiah Cleary raised his shotgun, but Wyatt was faster. The Winchester cracked, and Cleary was thrown backward off his horse before his finger could twitch the trigger. The other 2 hired guns drew their irons, filling the air with the deafening roar of gunfire. Bullets tore through the wooden porch, sending splinters flying. Wyatt dove behind a heavy oak water trough, returning fire with lethal precision. Another of Dalton's men slumped over his saddle. Dalton, roaring with fury, spurred his massive horse forward, aiming a heavy cavalry pistol right at Wyatt's exposed flank. Wyatt was busy pinning down the 3rd gunman and didn't see the cattle baron bearing down on him. But Abigail did. Time seemed to slow. She remembered Wyatt's voice: breathe out, squeeze, don't pull. She raised the pearl-handled Colt with both hands, aimed at the mountain of a man rushing her husband, and pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised her palm, but the shot rang true. The bullet caught Dalton in the shoulder, shattering his collarbone. He screamed, dropping his pistol as his horse reared, throwing the massive man to the snowy ground with a bone-crunching thud. The remaining gunman, seeing his boss fall, turned his horse and fled into the pines. Silence descended on the valley once more, thick and suffocating. Wyatt slowly stood up from behind the trough, his eyes wide as he looked at Abigail. She was trembling violently, smoke curling from the barrel of her gun, but she stood her ground. Then a pathetic whimper broke the silence. Silas had thrown himself off his horse during the crossfire and was crawling backward in the snow, his hands raised in surrender. Wyatt dropped the lever of his Winchester, chambering a fresh round, and walked slowly toward the man who had ruined so many lives. "Wyatt, please," Silas sobbed, tears freezing on his dirty cheeks. "Don't shoot. I'll leave. I'll never come back to Wyoming. I swear it on God." Wyatt aimed the rifle directly at Silas's forehead. His finger tightened on the trigger. 3 years of grief, rage, and the memory of a hanged 19-year-old boy screamed at him to pull it. "Wyatt." Abigail stepped off the porch, her boots crunching in the snow. She walked up beside him and placed a gentle, steadying hand on the steel barrel of his rifle. "He isn't worth it," she said softly, looking into Wyatt's tortured eyes. "Thomas wouldn't want you to become a murderer to avenge him. Let him live with his cowardice. Let him run." Wyatt stared at Silas for a long, agonizing moment. The muscles in his jaw worked furiously. Then, slowly, he lowered the rifle. "Get on your horse, Silas," Wyatt whispered, his voice dripping with lethal promise. "If I ever see your face in this territory again, I won't hesitate." Silas scrambled to his feet, hauled himself onto his horse, and rode away without looking back. Dalton, groaning in the bloody snow, was bound and hauled to the sheriff in Sheridan the next day to face charges for attempted murder and hiring outlaws. That night, the cabin was quiet again. Wyatt sat by the fire, wrapping a bandage around a deep splinter wound on his forearm. Abigail knelt beside him, taking the linen from his hands to finish the knot herself. "You saved my life today, Mrs. Callahan," Wyatt said, his voice thick with emotion he rarely showed. Abigail looked up, her gaze meeting his. The ghosts of the past, Silas, Dalton, the debt, the revenge, seemed to have finally burned away in the gun smoke. "You saved mine first," she replied softly. Wyatt reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a streak of soot from her cheek. There was no debt between them anymore, no contract, no convenience. Just two survivors who had found something real in the brutal heart of the frontier. He leaned in, and as their lips met for the first time, it was a promise stronger than any paper a judge could sign. The Laramie ledger burned, but Wyatt and Abigail Callahan's legacy was etched into Wyoming bedrock. They transformed a sanctuary of vengeance into an empire forged by love. Silas faded into the forgotten dust of cowards, while Abigail, the woman once traded for a poker debt, became the matriarch of the Bighorns. She never truly belonged to anyone. She simply found the man strong enough to stand beside her forever.